This narrative is a character string generated by an AI, large language model, statistically arranging words, and its truthfulness has not been verified. Such outputs without basis are called hallucinations. While confabulation more accurately reflects reality than hallucination, we follow convention. Therefore, the content described has no relation whatsoever to any real persons, organizations, nations, or events. Hallucination begins. The Oil Apocalypse, Chronicle of Venezuela's Syrianization, Prologue, Operation Absolute Resolve, January 3, 2026, above Caracas, 3:47 a.m. U.S. military stealth helicopters cut through the darkness. Delta Force operatives stormed Miraflores Palace and apprehended President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores. Operation Absolute Resolve, Southern Spear was completed in just 18 minutes. At dawn in New York, President Trump declared victory from the White House. Today, freedom returns to Venezuela. America will run Venezuela. Secretary of State Rubio held a press conference detailing plans for managing oil assets. But in the slums of Caracas, a different story was about to begin. Part 1, Power Vacuum and the End of Silence, January to March 2026. Caracas, a journalist's witness, Ana Rodriguez, 27, stared out the window of her small apartment in the Pater district. As an independent journalist, she had covered Venezuela's chaos for the past 5 years. Her family were fervent Chavistas, but the economic crisis had left them struggling to find food. Is this liberation, or is it invasion? Ana wrote this in her notebook. The interim government would be led by Vice President Cilia Rodriguez, but her authority was questionable. Within 24 hours, the Venezuelan Armed Forces, FANB, began to split. At eastern bases, pro-American officers declared loyalty to the interim government. But in the west and south, different movements were taking shape. Andes Mountains, flight of the Loyalists. In the mountainous region of Merida State, Colonel Carlos Mendez gathered his subordinates. A former commander of FANB elite units, he had received anti-American education under the Maduro regime. Comrades, this is not surrender. This is strategic withdrawal. Around Carlos, approximately 800 loyalist soldiers and leaders of the colectivos, government-backed militias, had assembled. They had fled into the mountains with equipment and weapons. We cannot hand over Commander Chavez's legacy to the imperialists. We will continue the resistance. Encrypted messages had already arrived on Carlos's smartphone. The sender was Moscow's friend, a contact from a Russian PMC, private military company, Maracaibo, the cartel's opportunity. In the western oil city of Maracaibo, different forces were beginning to move. The regional boss of Trenda Aragua, a man called El Tiger, was meeting with his lieutenants in the control room of an occupied oil refinery. Now that there's no government, this is ours. His organization had originally been a criminal network born in prisons. But over the past decade, through drug trafficking, human trafficking, and illegal mining, it had evolved into a paramilitary organization. Maduro is gone. Police and military are in chaos. Now is the time to expand business. El Tiger's laptop displayed messages from Colombian cartels, Chinese intermediaries, and Iranian businessmen. The political vacuum was a gift from heaven for criminal organizations. Colombian border, the beginning of crossing. At the border checkpoint in San Antonio del Taquira, chaos had already begun. Thousands of civilians were trying to flee to the Colombian side. But it wasn't just refugees crossing the border. ELN, National Liberation Army, fighters were also using this opportunity to flow into Venezuelan territory. Now that there's no central government, borders are meaningless. ELN Commander Comandante Eduardo told his subordinates at a temporary camp in the jungle. Western Venezuela will become our new liberated zone. They had already made contact with Carlos Mendez's loyalists. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The common purpose of anti-Americanism was about to create a strange alliance. Part 2, The Gestation of Proxy War, April to August 2026. Moscow, the Kremlin's decision. Russian Presidential Office, 11 o'clock a.m. President Vladimir Putin listened to the Security Council's report. Venezuela is not just about oil for us. The FSB director pointed to the map. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to undermine U.S. influence in South America. Putin nodded quietly. It's time to apply what we learned in Syria. We won't intervene directly, but we'll provide everything the anti-American forces need. Carlos Mendez's profile appeared on the conference room screen. Deploy Wagner Group. But officially, they don't exist. Weapons, training, communications equipment, channel everything through dark routes. For Russia, Venezuela was a stage for revenge. Retaliation on a distant battlefield for the pressure received in Ukraine. Beijing, quiet investment. At the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, a different approach was being discussed. We don't need to be conspicuous like Russia, stated a state councillor. We'll exercise influence through economic presence. China already held tens of billions of dollars in claims on Venezuela. Oil development, infrastructure, communications. Chinese companies were involved in everything. We'll deal with both the interim government and opposition forces. Whoever wins, we won't lose. Days later, Chinese-made encrypted communications equipment and satellite phones were delivered to Carlos Mendez's organization. The sender was unknown. Around the same time, the interim government also received a proposal for oil production restart support from a Chinese state-owned enterprise. Beijing was betting on all horses. Tehran, the third hand. At the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters, Venezuela was seen as an opportunity for expanding influence outside the Middle East. We can fight in America's backyard. And far from our homeland. Iran had the proxy war know-how cultivated in Syria and Iraq. What they provided wasn't just weapons, drone technology, rocket manufacturing knowledge, and most importantly, tactical guidance in asymmetric warfare. Revolutionary Guard advisors secretly landed in Venezuela. Their destination was the mountainous region controlled by Carlos Mendez. Caracas, the interim government struggle. The U.S.-backed interim government controlled only the center of the capital, Caracas. Interim President Delcy Rodriguez held her head in her hands in her office, surrounded by U.S. military advisors. We've completely lost control of the provinces. Maracaibo has fallen to cartels. Merida is under rebel control. Oil production is at a standstill. U.S. Colonel Michael Stone, 82nd Airborne Division, pointed to the map. We can provide limited airstrike support, but large-scale ground force deployment is politically impossible. Stone thought to himself, this is Iraq all over again. No, worse. The interim government's authority extended only to the green zone where U.S. forces were stationed, the wealthy eastern Caracas districts of Chacao and La Castellana, in area, less than 20% of the entire capital. Pater District. Colectivo Resistance. In the Pater district of western Caracas, Colectivo leader El Pantro was giving a speech in front of a barricade. Hundreds of young people gathered, holding portraits of Chavez and Maduro. Comrades, the imperialists kidnapped our president and occupied our country. But the revolution is not dead. The crowd raised their fists. Long live Chavez! Long live the revolution! Behind El Pantro, militiamen with Chinese-made AK-47s stood in line. Most were in their early 20s, a generation raised in unemployment and poverty. Ana Rodriguez was filming this scene with a hidden camera. She had realized, the anger of these young people was real, but also that it was being exploited by foreign powers. Venezuela is becoming Syria. Ana wrote this in her notebook. Part 3, Expansion of Flames. September to December 2026. Maracaibo, beginning of the resource war. On September 15, the first major battle occurred in the Maracaibo oil fields. Interim government forces, U.S.-supported, launched an attack to recapture refineries occupied by Tren de Aragua. However, the cartel was stronger than expected. El Tiger's forces destroyed interim government armored vehicles one after another with Russian-made Coronet anti-tank missiles. Where did they get such weapons? U.S. advisor Major Johnson was stunned hearing the battlefield reports. This isn't just a criminal organization. It's a paramilitary force. The battle lasted 3 days, with over 200 deaths on both sides. The refinery was destroyed, and black smoke covered Maracaibo's sky, and no one became the victor. The following week, Carlos Mendez's loyalist forces attacked from the south, and a three-way battle began. Merida Mountains, full-scale guerrilla warfare. Carlos Mendez's organization now called itself the Venezuelan Patriotic Liberation Army, APLV. Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisor Captain Reza Mohammadi was training them in asymmetric warfare. You can't win in conventional warfare, but you can win in guerrilla warfare. Mohammadi spread out a map. Attack cities with suicide drones. Supply routes with IEDs. And always flee, hide, and reappear. APLV fighters rapidly became sophisticated. They hid in the mountains during the day and launched attacks at night. On October 3, 1A supply convoy was attacked on the main road to Caracas. Russian-made portable rocket launchers set trucks ablaze. 4 U.S. soldiers died. America's first war dead in Venezuela. Border region, the reality of spillover. In Cúcuta, a Colombian border city, the crisis was deepening. Refugees from Venezuela had already exceeded 1.5 million. But refugees weren't the only problem. ELN, FARC dissidents, and Venezuelan cartels, multiple armed groups were freely crossing the border and beginning operations on the Colombian side. Colombian Army Colonel Pablo Sanchez was reporting to the Defense Ministry in Bogotá. We are no longer defending one border. We've acquired a second front. In November, a combined APLV and ELN force that had crossed from Venezuela attacked a Colombian military outpost in northeastern Colombia. 12 Colombian soldiers died. The Venezuelan conflict was no longer a civil war in one country. It was transforming into a regional war. Caracas, the journalist's decision. Ana Rodriguez had seen hell these past months. Bombings, gunfights, starvation. Her camera had recorded everything. But what pierced her heart most was her younger brother Jose going missing. Jose was 19. Unemployed, he had suddenly disappeared one day. Later, Ana learned her brother had been conscripted by the ELN. That's enough. Ana wrote her final article in her notebook. The title, Venezuela's Fracture, Syria's Shadow. Maduro's capture was supposed to open the door to freedom. But in reality, it only opened the door to endless war hell. The great powers are enjoying their proxy war games. Meanwhile, our country is shattering into pieces. In December, Ana crossed the Colombian border. In her hand was a hard drive containing a year's worth of records. Part 4, Completion of Syrianization, 2027 to 2028. A divided nation. By early 2027, Venezuela was no longer a single nation. Caracas Green Zone, controlled by the interim government and U.S. military. Power and water function limitedly but completely dependent on external supplies. Western Maracaibo region, cartel coalition centered on Tren de Aragua declared the Free Maracaibo Federation. Funded through illegal oil trade. Central Southern Mountain region, controlled by APLV, Carlos Mendez. Base of resistance supported by Russia, Iran, and China. Eastern Orinoco River Basin, multiple small armed groups fighting over gold mines. De facto anarchy. Border zone, sanctuarized by ELN and FARC dissidents. Border with Colombia disappeared. This was precisely the structure of the Syrian civil war. Assad regime, opposition forces, ISIS, Kurdish forces, each receiving foreign support, continuing endless battle. Colombia's intervention. In June 2027, the Colombian government finally made its decision. President Gustavo Petro addressed the nation. We can no longer stand by. Over 2 million refugees, armed clashes at the border, intensification of drug trafficking. This is a matter of our nation's survival. Therefore, I authorize limited military operations in border zones. Colombian army armored units crossed the border. However, this only worsened the situation. APLV, ELN, and cartels intensified attacks on Colombian forces as foreign invaders. Venezuela's civil war escalated into regional warfare. The oil curse. By early 2028, Venezuela's crude oil production had collapsed to below 300,000 barrels per day from the former 3 million barrels, less than one-tenth, but that didn't end the war. Rather, the fight over remaining oil intensified, pipelines were blown up, refineries became ruins, oil fields burned. Crude was no longer a national asset but war booty for armed groups. And in black markets, Russian and Chinese intermediaries continued buying plundered crude. That money transformed into new weapons and returned to Venezuela again, the oil curse, the paradox that resource-rich countries are more likely to fall into conflict. Venezuela became its perfect case study. International community's paralysis, the UN Security Council had completely fallen into dysfunction. The US and its allies claimed restoration of democracy. Russia and China condemned sovereignty violations and exercised their veto power. All mediation attempts failed. No one wanted to compromise. At a Washington think tank, an analyst spoke anonymously, "We succeeded in eliminating Maduro. But we had no plan for what to build afterward." Trump said we won, but in reality, we just stepped into a swamp. U.S. military presence costs exceeded $1 billion per month. But there was no exit in sight. Epilogue, Endless Chaos, 2029, Ruins of Caracas. Sofia, a 12-year-old girl, sat on rubble. Where a school once stood, only the remains of buildings destroyed by shelling remained. Dad used to say this was a beautiful country. Sofia stared at an old Chavez poster remaining on a wall. The poster was riddled with bullet holes. Stories about the old days don't matter. Sofia, her brother Miguel, 16, approached. An AK-47 was slung over his shoulder. Miguel was now a collectivo child soldier. Just think about surviving today. Think about tomorrow when tomorrow comes. An explosion sounded in the distance. No one was surprised anymore. It was the music of daily life. Final report, Bogotá, Colombia. Ana Rodriguez continued writing her memoir in a small apartment. Deaths from the Venezuelan conflict, conservatively estimated, exceed 300,000. External refugees reached 6 million. Venezuela as a nation is now merely a name on a map. Multiple armed forces, multiple foreign powers, and multiple legitimate governments exist. It's not a nation but a conflict zone. History repeats itself. What happened in Syria was replicated in Venezuela. And the world learned nothing. Anna continued typing. I must ask, was eliminating one dictator truly justice? Or did we merely open the door to a new hell? The answer lies in the ruins of Caracas. Historian's perspective. 2035. Years later, historians of international relations came to call this era the oil apocalypse. One academic paper concluded, the 2026 Venezuelan intervention became an example of great power proxy warfare in the 21st century. The pattern established in the Syrian civil war, 2011 national fragmentation, proliferation of multiple forces, foreign power support, was replicated intact in South America. The greatest lesson is that eliminating a dictator alone does not bring peace. Rather, intervention without planning generates more serious chaos. Venezuela, like Syria, became a conflict zone with no end in sight. And those who always paid the price were ordinary citizens. Sofia's future. 2035. Now 18, Sofia is in a Colombian refugee camp. She hasn't seen her brother Miguel in 6 years. She doesn't know if he's alive or dead. But Sofia hadn't given up. She continued studying at the refugee camp school and had won a scholarship to attend university. Someday, I'll return home, Sofia vowed while gazing at a map of Venezuela, and I want to leave a peaceful country for my children. But that day was still far away. In Caracas, gunfire still echoed today. Hallucination ends.